The 40-story glass tower in downtown Chicago was a monument to other people's dreams. For Jonathan Hayes, its reflective surface was a daily reminder of the man he was supposed to be. Every morning, as the L train rattled past his corner office on the 32nd floor, he would catch a glimpse of his own silhouette, a sharp, successful cutout in a Tom Ford suit, a picture of corporate ascendancy. But the reflection felt hollow, a costume he hadn't chosen but had learned to wear with such proficiency that it now felt grafted to his skin. He was a senior vice president at Sterling & Crest, a global consulting firm. His father, a retired Army colonel, had framed his first promotion with the same solemn pride he'd once reserved for Jonathan's childhood report cards. "My son, the strategist," he'd say at family barbecues in their neat Cincinnati suburb, clapping a heavy hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "Finally putting that sharp mind of yours to real use." Jonathan would smile, a tight, practiced expression that never quite reached his eyes. He never mentioned that the sharp mind had once dreamed of writing sweeping, symphonic scores, not quarterly financial reports. The memory surfaced, unbidden and sharp, as he sat through another Monday morning budget meeting. The scent of stale coffee and ambition filled the air. His boss, a man named Robert whose smile was as warm as a spreadsheet, was droning on about sign-regizing deliverables. Jonathan's gaze drifted to his own hands, resting on the polished mahogany table. They were soft, manicured, the hands of a man who pushed paper. He remembered different hands. Hands calloused from hours holding a violin bow, fingers flying across the fingerboard, creating something that wasn't just profitable, but beautiful. He had been first chair in his university orchestra, a prodigy, his professor had said. But in his junior year, his father had sat him down. "Music is a fine hobby, son," he'd said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "But a career? It's not stable. It's not substantial. A man needs to build a legacy." And so, Jonathan had built one. He'd switched his major to business administration. He'd packed away his violin in its hard-shell case and stored it in the back of his closet, a relic of a fanciful youth. He'd taken the internship at Sterling & Crest, then the entry-level position, and he'd climbed. He married Clara, a lovely, pragmatic woman his mother adored, bought a house in the right neighborhood, and drove the right car. He had curated a life that was a masterpiece of external approval. But the music, the true soundtrack of his soul, had been silenced. The catalyst came from the most mundane of places, a corporate wellness seminar. The speaker, a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice, asked them to participate in an exercise. "I want you to close your eyes," she instructed the room of 200 type A overachievers. "And I want you to remember a moment from your childhood or young adulthood when you felt completely, unapologetically yourself. A moment of pure joy, not tied to an achievement or validation from someone else." The room shifted uncomfortably. Jonathan closed his eyes, expecting the usual mental static of to-do lists and project deadlines. But instead, a memory, vivid and technicolor, flooded his mind. He was 19, on the stage of the university auditorium. The air was electric. The final, soaring notes of Tchaikovsky's violin concerto were pouring from his instrument, his body swaying with the music, not as a performer, but as a conduit. The applause that followed was a distant roar. The real reward was the lingering vibration in his chest, the profound sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was born to do. When he opened his eyes, the sterile, gray and beige conference room felt like a prison. A cold dread settled in his stomach, so heavy and profound it was hard to breathe. It wasn't just the violin. It was a cascade of realizations. He saw himself choosing the safe major. He saw himself proposing to Clara with a ring he knew would impress her friends, not because his heart was bursting with poetry. He saw himself nodding in agreement at his father's political rants. Biting his tongue when a colleague took credit for his work, saying yes to coaching his son's soccer team when he hated the very sight of a field, all to maintain the facade of the perfect son, the perfect husband, the perfect employee. He had spent 2 decades meticulously building a life that was a monument to everyone else's expectations. He had become a ghost in his own story, a careful curator of an image, while the real Jonathan Hayes, the passionate, musical, messy, and authentic Jonathan, had been quietly, systematically betrayed. The reflection in the glass tower wasn't just hollow, it was a lie. And in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the ventilation system and the sound of his own carefully constructed life crumbling from the inside out, Jonathan knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating clarity, that the silence had to end. The cost of this approval was his very soul, and the bill had just come due. The realization didn't ignite a sudden, dramatic fire. Instead, it festered, a quiet, corrosive acid eating away at the foundations of his carefully constructed life. For weeks, Jonathan moved through his world like a sleepwalker. The budget reports blurred into meaningless figures, Clara's chatter about redecorating the guest room sounded like static, and the firm handshake he'd perfected felt like a betrayal every time he offered it. The memory of the violin, once a dormant, bittersweet nostalgia, had become a persistent, phantom ache in his hands. He found himself taking the long way home, driving through neighborhoods he'd never seen, past music shops with old instruments glowing warmly in their windows. One Tuesday evening, pulled by a force he didn't understand, he parked his sensible sedan and walked into one called the Fiddle and the Bow. The bell above the door chimed, a sound far more pleasant than the electronic ping of his office elevator. The air smelled of wood polish, resin, and dust, a sacred, ancient scent. An old man with kind eyes and fingers stained with varnish looked up from a workbench where he was delicately adjusting the soundpost of a cello. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice raspy but gentle. Jonathan's throat was tight. He couldn't form the words. He just shook his head and wandered through the small shop, his eyes tracing the curves of violins, violas, and cellos hanging like captured souls waiting for a musician to breathe life into them. He felt like an imposter, a tourist in his own past. His gaze fell upon a beautiful, amber-colored violin hanging slightly apart from the others. It wasn't the most expensive, but it had a quiet dignity, a patient grace. "That one has a lovely voice," the old man said, appearing beside him without a sound. "Warm. A bit sad, but with a strong heart. It's been waiting for the right player." Without thinking, Jonathan heard himself say, May I see it?" The man carefully took the violin down and handed it to him with the reverence one might show a holy relic. The weight of it in his hands was a seismic shock to his system. It was familiar and foreign all at once. His left hand, of its own volition, found its way to the neck, his fingers falling onto the fingerboard in the shape of a G major chord. It was an echo from 2 decades ago, a muscle memory his body had refused to forget. "Go on," the old man encouraged softly, handing him a bow. Jonathan lifted the violin to his chin, the contact sending a shiver through him. He drew the bow across the A string. The note that rang out was pure, clear, and it vibrated not just in the wood of the instrument, but deep within the marrow of his bones. It was a sound that recognized him. It was the voice of the ghost he had locked away. He played a few more tentative notes, a simple scale, his technique rusty, his fingers stiff. But beneath the clumsiness was the undeniable, raw truth of it. This was him. This was the sound of Jonathan Hayes. Tears, hot and shameful, welled in his eyes. He quickly put the instrument down, muttering a choked thank you, and almost ran from the shop, the bell chiming mockingly behind him. He sat in his car for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching the traffic lights change from green to yellow to red. The confrontation wasn't with the world, it was within. The battle lines were drawn between the SVP of Sterling and Crest and the 19-year-old musician, and the battlefield was his own soul. The breaking point came at the firm's annual gala, a glittering event at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was the pinnacle of everything he was supposed to want. He was in his tuxedo, Clara radiant on his arm, schmoozing with partners and their wives, his laugh a hollow, practiced sound. He was standing before a massive, abstract painting, a swirl of bold, emotional colors, when Robert clapped him on the back. "There's my star player," Robert boomed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch. "Big news, John. The London expansion is a go. The board wants you to head it up. It's a 5-year commitment, minimum. It's the final step, son. A few years in London, and my seat is yours." It was the ultimate validation, the prize he had been working toward for 15 years. The corner office on the top floor, the title of managing partner, the legacy his father would finally, truly deem substantial. The people around him were smiling, congratulating him. Clara squeezed his arm, her eyes shining with pride. And in that moment, surrounded by everything he had supposedly earned, Jonathan felt the last thread of his old self snap. He saw the next 5 years with terrifying clarity: the endless meetings, the soul-crushing travel, the polite conversations at London cocktail parties, the slow, final burial of the man with the violin. He would be presiding over the funeral of his own spirit. He looked at Robert, at Clara, at the sea of expectant, smiling faces. The noise of the gala faded into a dull roar. He saw his father's proud, stern face superimposed over them all. "No," Jonathan said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the chatter around them like a scalpel. Robert's smile didn't falter, it just became confused. "I'm sorry, John, what was that?" "I said no, Robert," Jonathan repeated, his voice stronger now, clearer. "I don't want the promotion. I don't want to go to London." A stunned silence fell over their little group. Clara's hand tightened on his arm, her nails digging in. "Jonathan," she hissed, her smile frozen in place. "What are you doing? This is what we've worked for." He turned to her, and for the first time, he looked at her not as his wife, but as a part of the beautiful, gilded cage. "No, Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is what you worked for. What you wanted. I just went along with it." He turned back to Robert, whose face was now turning a dangerous shade of purple. "I quit, Robert. Effective immediately." The rest was a blur of shocked gasps, Clara's tearful, furious whispers, and Robert's sputtered threats about non-competes and professional suicide. Jonathan didn't hear most of it. He felt light, untethered, dizzy with a terrifying, exhilarating freedom. He walked out of the gala, leaving his tuxedo jacket on a marble statue in the Grand Hall. He didn't go home that night. He drove directly back to the Fiddle and the Bow. It was closed, but he sat on the curb outside until the old man arrived to open the shop the next morning. The old man didn't seem surprised to see him. He simply unlocked the door and gestured him inside. "I'd like to buy the violin," Jonathan said, his voice raw from a night of no sleep and silent weeping. "The amber one." He paid for it with his corporate credit card, a final, symbolic act of severance. He then drove to a quiet park overlooking Lake Michigan. The morning was crisp, the lake a vast, gray expanse of possibility. He took the violin out of its case, the morning sun glinting off its wood. This time, his hands didn't shake. He tucked it under his chin, raised the bow, and began to play. It wasn't Tchaikovsky. It was something simple, a melody that was forming in his mind as he played, raw and unpolished but utterly his own. It was a song of grief for the 20 years he had lost, of fear for the uncertain future, but also of a long-awaited homecoming. The notes, hesitant at first, grew stronger, weaving into the sound of the wind and the waves. He played for the man he had been, for the man he had pretended to be, and for the man he hoped, against all odds, he could still become. He was alone, with no audience to impress, no one to judge, no one to approve. And for the first time in 20 years, the silence was not inside him. It was all around him, and he was finally, completely, filling it with a sound that was authentically, unapologetically, his own. The performance for the world was over. The concert for himself had just begun. The following months became the most difficult and most liberating period of Jonathan's life. He moved from a spacious house in the suburbs to a small rented apartment in a neighborhood inhabited by artists and musicians. The air here didn't smell of freshly cut grass, but of coffee and old wood, and he found this scent infinitely more honest. The divorce from Clara was painful but inevitable. They were two people who spoke different languages and wanted fundamentally different lives. It pained him to see her confusion and anger, but he understood that staying for the sake of peace would have been a greater betrayal, to her and to himself. The conversation with his father was even more difficult. The silence on the other end of the line, after Jonathan said he was leaving his corporate career to pursue music, was deafening. "I don't understand, son," his father finally said, his voice weary. "We gave you every opportunity. And you chose to be a drifter." But strangely, those words no longer hurt. Because Jonathan had finally understood the difference between the opportunities he was given and the opportunities he actually wanted to take. He did not become a famous violinist. His story is not a fairy tale about a former vice president conquering Carnegie Hall. His path was more modest and, he felt, more honest. He started small. He took lessons from the old master at the fiddle and the bow, rediscovering the instrument and himself. He played for himself for hours, until his fingers were calloused again, and that feeling was more valuable to him than any bonus. He found a job, not a career, a job. He taught music fundamentals to children at a local community center. He saw their eyes light up when they produced a clean note for the first time, and that feeling was more significant than any praise from Robert. In the evenings, he sometimes played in a string quartet that performed in small cafes and at local weddings. The money was modest, but the applause was real. They were applauding not his title or his suit, but the music he helped create. One spring day, almost a year after that fateful gala, he was walking through the park with his violin on his back. He was on his way to a quartet rehearsal. On a bench, he saw his father. He was sitting alone, watching the ducks on the pond. Jonathan almost walked past, but something stopped him. "Dad," he said quietly. His father flinched and turned. His gaze fell on the violin case. There was no anger in his eyes, only a deep, profound weariness and, perhaps, a glimmer of curiosity. "Sit down," he grunted. Jonathan sat. They were silent for a minute. "I'm not a drifter, Dad," Jonathan finally said. "I'm a teacher. And I'm a musician. I pay my bills. I found what makes me whole." His father nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the water. "Your mother. She worries about you. Says you look happy." "I am." Another silence, longer this time. "I always wanted stability for you," his father said, and his voice trembled. "I was afraid the world would break you. Music. It seemed so fragile." "Sometimes, Dad," Jonathan said softly, "the greatest strength is not to resist the storm, but to have the flexibility to weather it. Music taught me that." He didn't expect his father to understand. But he saw him digesting his words. He didn't apologize or approve of his choice. But as he was leaving, his father said, "Take care of yourself, son." And in those words, there was something more than just a farewell. That evening, at the rehearsal, their quartet was practicing a new piece. It was a complex, emotional composition. When they reached the climax, and the sounds of their instruments merged into one, creating something greater than the sum of their parts, Jonathan felt it again, that same feeling from the stage 20 years earlier. A complete, absolute belonging to the moment. He wasn't a vice president. He wasn't a disappointing son. He was simply a part of the music. Later, back in his modest apartment, he took out his violin and played a quiet, simple melody of his own composition. It was about forgiveness, forgiving himself for those 20 years, and forgiving those who didn't understand. He looked out the window at the city lights, the very city where he had once built a tower of others' expectations. The tower had collapsed. But on its ruins, he had built himself a home. It was small, imperfect, but it was his. And within its walls, there was always music. He was no longer the youngest vice president in the history of Sterling and Crest. He was simply Jonathan Hayes, musician. And for him, that was more than enough. The path to himself had turned out to be longer than the career ladder to the top of a skyscraper, but it had led him where he needed to be. He had finally stopped betraying the man he had always been, and in that fidelity to himself, he found a peace that no corporate title could ever buy. The concept of success, Jonathan realized, was not a fixed destination but a melody that each person had to compose for themselves. His new life was not one of grand, theatrical gestures, but of quiet, daily affirmations. His apartment, a far cry from his suburban estate, was filled with the things that truly resonated with his soul: shelves of sheet music, well-loved books on composers, and the gentle, lingering scent of rosin. The silence he had once feared was now a comfortable space, eagerly awaiting the notes he would choose to fill it with. His teaching at the community center became his anchor. He wasn't just instructing children on how to hold a bow, he was giving them a language for their emotions. He saw shy, introverted kids find confidence and boisterous ones learn focus. One of his students, a quiet girl named Maya, reminded him of his younger self. After weeks of struggle, she finally managed a clear, resonant note on her tiny violin. The triumphant, astonished smile she gave him was a reward more profound than any year-end bonus. He was no longer climbing a corporate ladder, he was planting seeds, and the satisfaction was of a different, deeper quality. His relationship with his father evolved into a fragile, new form. There were no dramatic reconciliations, but a series of small, hesitant steps. His father began to call, not to lecture, but to ask, with a hesitant curiosity, "How is the teaching going?" During one visit, Jonathan found his father quietly looking at a framed photo on his mantelpiece, a picture of Jonathan at 19, playing his violin at a university recital, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. His father didn't say anything, but he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was not approval, Jonathan understood, but a dawning, reluctant acknowledgement. He was witnessing his son not falling apart, but building a different kind of man, one whose strength came from integrity rather than title. The string quartet became his community. They were an eclectic group, a high school music teacher, a freelance graphic designer, a retired librarian. They argued over tempos, celebrated a perfectly executed phrase with laughter, and drank cheap wine after rehearsals. They knew nothing of Sterling and Crest, and they liked him for his timing and his tone, not his networking skills. In their company, he felt seen for what he could create, not for what he could bill. One evening, as he was walking home from a rehearsal, his violin case a familiar, comforting weight on his back, he passed the gleaming tower that housed his old firm. He stopped and looked up. The windows, once the cells of his self-imposed prison, now seemed small and distant. There was no resentment in his gaze, only a quiet sense of closure. The man in the Tom Ford suit was a stranger to him now, a character from a play he had finally finished performing. He arrived home, poured a glass of wine, and opened the window to let in the cool night air. The city hummed its own chaotic symphony below. He took out his violin, the amberwood warm and familiar under his touch. He began to play a new piece he was writing, a composition that wove together the melancholy of loss with the soaring hope of a second chance. It was not perfect, it was a work in progress, much like its composer. As the final note faded into the night, Jonathan Hayes stood in the quiet of his apartment, completely alone, and yet, for the first time in his adult life, he did not feel lonely. He was home. The journey had cost him a previously curated life, but it had returned to him something infinitely more valuable, himself. He had learned that the most profound legacy a person can build is not etched on a nameplate or listed in a corporate directory, but is woven into the quiet, authentic moments of a life truly lived. The music had ended, but the melody of his new beginning had just started.